Richard Skipper celebrates. Every show is a celebration. Each show, Richard delivers the artists you love, showcasing what makes them unique. Never gossipy. The antidote to a sometimes hectic world. Now, here's your host, Richard Skipper.
Happy Monday, everyone. Happy President's Day, and welcome to the latest edition of Richard Skipper Celebrates. This is the show in which I celebrate artists and their body of worth. And today, boy, do I have an artist to celebrate with you. But before I tell you about our special guest today, I want to talk a little bit about myself. And there's a reason. This past week, I turned 60 years old. Or 60 years young, I'd like to think. And 47 years ago, I was growing up on a tobacco farm in Conway, South Carolina, and dreaming of coming to New York and being a part of the Great White Way. I mentioned the age. I was 13 at the time, because that's the age of our guest today. And I will tell you, I have been lucky enough over the past year when this pandemic began and I started doing this live stream podcast to have some of the biggest names in show business. But I will tell you, and I have been able to celebrate some of the greatest names, but none of them have engendered as much as excitement as our guest today. And before I bring him on, everyone in this business needs a little zazz. And this guy certainly has it. Ladies and gentlemen, Charles Kirsch.
My favorite song in the prom is Azaz. It's sung by Angie, an aging chorus girl played by Angie Schworer, to Emma to try to cheer her up after the whole prom fiasco. It's also trying to convince her that she has the zazz, the personality, to go out and share her own story. It's a Fosse pastiche, and the technical story behind the song is that once a third understudy had to go on for Roxy Hart, and she was doing everything right, but she didn't have the zazz, the personality. So this is the song where Angie teaches Emma to find her own inner zazz. When the folks say you can't win, what'll stop them in a hurry? I'll give it some zazz. There's no contest for a girl who has some razzmatazz. So call their bluff and strut your stuff like no chick in this hick town has. So instead of giving up, I'll give it some zazz.
Charles, you certainly have the zazz. I want to tell everyone, just before we went live, I always am listening to show tunes. Charles, I hate to say this, but you remind me of where I was years ago, but you've got that it factor 10 times over and beyond. But before we went live, I am listening to Lena Horne, A Lady and Her Music. And Charles said, "Are you listening to Lena Horne?" Just before we went live, you amaze me on so many levels. I want to ask you, first of all, how are you doing really in the midst of this crazy world we find ourselves in right now?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me, Richard, and also happy birthday. Happy belated birthday.
Thank you.
So, well, in certain ways, as much as I hate to say this, I think that this pandemic has been a good thing in some ways, because I've been able to create this podcast and all these things that I do. And I think in some ways that's been easier because everyone has more time and everyone's at home. But in some ways it's difficult because, of course, I can't see the amount of theater I was seeing before. And of course, I miss that a lot. And I feel like since I haven't had as much opportunity to see those shows, I really hope that they come back pretty soon so I can get my record back on track there. So
They will. But I want to ask you, when did you first begin this love of theater? Did you listen to this music at home? Was it because you went to the theater? How did it start for you?
Well, I've always been interested in doing theater and putting on shows. And in fact, when I was about 5, I think I planned a show of the Nutcracker to do with my whole family, including all my parents and grandparents and aunts and everything. And even though that never happened, it did inspire sort of the start of wanting to perform. But this sort of interest in theater history and like knowing things about theater came, I think, when I saw On the Town, it was not my first Broadway show. It was my third. I had seen Annie and Cinderella, which were both great, but they didn't really capture my interest as much as On the Town. And when we were first going to go to that, I didn't realize that it was going to have the effect that it had, and I actually wanted to go to a different Broadway show, but I'm so glad that that didn't end up happening, because being able to sort of see the magic of the singing and the dancing in that show made me want to not only do it myself, but also to learn more about it and to see more of it.
Now, what was it about that show that captured your imagination so much?
Well, I think it must have been partly, if you think about the difference between that and the other two shows, it must have been partly the older style, even though the other two shows had that a little bit too. But part of it is New York, I think, which I've always loved and never want to leave. I do live in New York. And I think part of it was just how visually sort of amazing it was to see everyone dancing and all the great costumes that there were for that show and sets.
Now, I grew up in a completely different era, Charles. When I was growing up, we had 3 networks. We had variety shows, and we were once in a blue moon able to hear some of these great Broadway songs in this. I'm assuming that the world of YouTube must have opened so many doors for you.
That's true. That's definitely true. There was a show that I wish I'd seen, although I didn't get to, although I later saw a bootleg, but don't tell anyone that, which was the On the 20th Century revival with Kristen Chenoweth and Peter Gallagher. And how I first sort of got interested in that, which partly because it was thinking it was almost like a second On the Town because it was by the same writers, even though it's very different. But I saw this clip online of Veronique from that show, of Kristen Chenoweth doing that. And I absolutely fell in love with that, and being able to have that resource, I think, was very valuable, because obviously I can't see everything. So the things I can't see, I can often see some of on YouTube, which I appreciate.
Now, does anyone else in your family have the same passion for the theater that you have? Do you have anyone in your family tree that are in the business? How did you first of all, you started your podcast at 13, or were you 12 when you started it?
I was 12 when I started. Yeah, but in my family, I don't have any people who really worked in the theater per se, with the exception of my great aunt's husband, whose name was Bob Miller, was a stagehand for a while in shows like Crazy for You. But I think that all of my family has always loved theater, so it's never something that's been like discouraged. In fact, it's been encouraged a lot.
Well, applause to your parents. I want to give them a big shout out. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think especially my mom, because my mom has lived in New York her whole life as opposed to my dad, so she had seen a ton of shows when she was little also, and so she can remember seeing like the Yul Brynner revival of The King and I in 1977 and all of that. And
in addition to all the work that you're doing here, you've also done some theater. Do you remember your first audition and what that experience was like when you got into your first show?
Well, my first audition, I think it must have been my first year of doing the Marymount Summer Camp, which is something that I was doing every year before this happened. It's something that, of course, the school Marymount does in the summer. And it was the first year. I was waiting till the last minute, actually, to decide what to sort of do in the summer. And then we found this performing arts camp, and I didn't know that it was going to be as great as it was. But the first time I auditioned, I was able to play Smee in Peter Pan. So I remember having to prepare, I don't think it was a set song. I think we had to prepare a song of our choice. I don't remember what I did, but I guess it must have gone okay.
You got cast.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
exact best. Now, I want to ask you, first of all, Charles, you are so good at what you do. I first became familiar with you back in October. I was talking with our mutual friend, Sandra Lee, and she said, you've got to check out Charles and his podcast. And when I went and I started watching and listening to your podcast, I was just amazed at the knowledge that you have with each of your guests. How did the first podcast come about for you?
Well, the first podcast happened in August, and the idea for it had happened before that. Like in July or so of that same year, which is just a month before, I had thought I want to start something like this because I do listen to a lot of theater podcasts and I find them all very interesting. And I thought maybe I could do something like this too. And at first I thought maybe it would just be something like a talking podcast rather than interviewing, because I didn't know that I would be able to sort of pull off an interview podcast with getting the amount of people. But then I thought that maybe it might be more interesting for anyone who wanted to listen if I was able to do that. So the first thing I did was pick a name, which was Backstage Babble, as you can see up there.
Yes. How did you come up with the name? Let's start there.
Well,
I know.
Well, it's a song from Applause, and my original idea was to use the name of a song. So then I sort of narrowed it down to what songs have like a name that would be appropriate. And yeah, it was between that and the song Intermission Talk from Me and Juliet. But I thought that Intermission Talk would like maybe imply something it wasn't with intermission. So I chose this one, and also because I love Charles Strauss and I love Applause. And then I've gotten to talk to at least 3 people who worked on Applause. So that's been great too. But anyway, that was the first thing I did. The second thing was to write a theme song, which I have, if you listen to the podcast, at first it was just me singing it with no accompaniment, and then the wonderful Tom Judson, who I can't thank enough here, offered to write sort of an accompaniment for it with piano, and so that's definitely enhanced it. But that was the second step. And then the third thing I did was to ask my first guest. That was the next step, which was actually my grandfather, who he was my first guest. And although he hasn't actually worked on a Broadway show, he has done several things that are theater related. Like he was the publicist for Great Performances, and he was on the 42nd Street redevelopment committee. And so he has sort of a lot of experience with that and a lot of stories about theater people and everything. So that was the first place I went, because I figured that he would say yes, and he did. So then the first episode I recorded was that, and after that I was able to sort of keep going on with some people who I had met beforehand.
And how did your research on theater history begin for you?
Well, I think it's mainly through a bunch of books. One of the first books that I would credit is Peter Felicia's Biggest Hits and Flops of
and
the
he's
Season.
Watching, I'll let you know that. Yes.
I saw that comment, and that's great. So that was one of the first books. There's also this book, which I'm forgetting the title of now, but it's by Stanley Green, and it is sort of a comprehensive list with casts and songs of every show. And then for a more sort of glossy coffee table book, there was this book called Broadway, the American Musical by Lawrence Maslon. And it was, I didn't know that it was a companion to the documentary until much later, but I sort of fell in love with that book and the images in it, and there's a lot of information packed in there too. And then of course, another big one, which no one will be surprised to hear, was Not Since Carrie, which of course deals with all the flops. And when I first discovered that, that taught me about a lot of shows that I hadn't known about, because the other ones, except for Peter's, mostly deal with the big hits.
And going back to, I mean, your research is just absolutely phenomenal. Going into this, is there any particular era of the theater that you really wish that you had been a part of, and why?
That's a good question. Maybe anything from 1970 to before, I think. 1970 or before, and that's something I've been fascinated to sort of try to build a picture of through some of my interviews, to get a real sense of what it was like during that era. And I just think, well, the shows that were on were, of course, better then, or at least in my opinion. And there was so much great talent then that I'll never be able to see on a stage, like Carol Channing, who you were just mentioning, or Ethel Merman, or Mary Martin. All those people I will never be able to see on the stage.
And what is the one thing that has surprised you most about the world of theater since you first started doing your podcast? And I want to let everyone know this has only been since August that you've been doing the podcast.
Yes.
How many people have you interviewed so far?
You know, I do keep track of that. I think it's something like 45 people now.
You.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm approaching my 50th episode, which will be a big guest. So yeah, what has surprised me most, I think, is, well, really to learn about some of the darker side, because people have been, and I've been lucky that people have been very honest about the people who they like and the people who they don't like, and the experiences that they remember that have been not as good. So it's not like a disillusionment thing or anything like that, but it's been interesting for me to learn about some of the other aspects and other sides that are a little bit more shady, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Now, yeah. You started out performing yourself long before the podcast. Now that you're doing the podcast, do you feel that once the pandemic is behind us and we're back to a sense of normalcy, whatever that may be, that you will go back to performing? Or do you feel that you want to stay on this side of the footlights? Or both?
Well, I mean, I would love to go back to performing in school and at the 92nd Street Y and everything like that. Although I was hearing this interview that you did actually with Rob Schneider a couple months ago. Mm-hmm. And he said a very interesting thing about how he felt like he didn't need to act, and so he didn't. And in some ways I feel the same way. And although I would never want to do anything else except for theater, I don't know that that's what I would want to do.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Rob Schneider. He's phenomenal at what he does. You are phenomenal, and you make the rest of us work harder. You realize that, don't you?
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And, you know, going back, you've interviewed, you started with your grandfather. Who was the first true member of the theater that you interviewed? And how did you get that interview?
In terms of like an actor or?
Yes, as far as an actor.
Well, the first person that I did who was an actor is someone who's actually watching tonight, I think, which is Ken Cantor, who I've been lucky enough to meet through a few other people like Peter Felicia. And the second one too was, the first one that I hadn't known before in any way was Stephen Hannon, who I also know through Peter Felicia. So that's a funny coincidence there.
Now I'm going to show a few pictures here, and these are just a few, a short sampling of some of the people that you've interviewed. There's Davis. Tell us about your interview with Jimmy Davis.
Oh, well, James Davis was amazing, and he's one of those people who I feel I notice the interviews getting longer and longer as the podcast proceeds, and my interview with him in total was about 3.5 hours.
Wow. Wow.
Not all at once, okay. But 3.5 hours over 2 parts. And he had wonderful stories about Via Galactica, which is a flop that's always fascinated me since I read about it in Not Since Carrie. And he had some stories about how right before opening night in summer rehearsals, all of the cast got stuck on like an elevated platform hanging above the stage, and there was no way for them to get down that they could see, so they were just hanging there in fright until finally the director was able to get someone to get them down, and they thought they were going to die, so eventually they took that part out of the show.
And you've also interviewed people behind the scenes. I mean, one of the greatest directors for cabaret and reviews is Barry Kleinbort.
Oh, yes.
What was your takeaway from this interview?
Well, really, the interview with Barry Kleinbort was it was almost like a lesson in theater, because he really, thank you for saying that I know a lot, but Barry Kleinbort knows everything about theater, and he had such great not only insight, but sort of advice about it. And he even used some examples, like he was telling me about Steel Pier, the Broadway musical, and how he thought they should have worked on it more, and he thought that they had too much confidence that even though the out-of-town trial went badly, it would do better once it got to New York. So it was very interesting to hear his perspective, because of course, also being a director, he knows what makes a good show.
And he's a brilliant, brilliant director. You've also gotten many interviews of people that I would love to interview. And here's one right here, Brad Oscar.
Yes, Brad Oscar was wonderful. He's someone who Something Rotten was one of the first shows I saw. And of course, how could you help but have a takeaway from that Brad Oscar was wonderful. So when I got to interview him, I was very excited. And he had a lot of stories. One of the fun ones was when he was talking about how every time he would do the producers, when he replaced in the producers, someone would come up to him afterwards and say, I would imagine that's just how Nathan Lane would do it. And eventually he got sort of frustrated because he felt that maybe he didn't want to be exactly like what Nathan Lane would do. But yeah, and he was someone who's very open about some of the shows, because he's done so many shows that are successful. Mm-hmm. And he was very open about sort of the feeling of doing shows that aren't successful and what that's like. And it seems like his honesty was impressive. Mm-hmm. And that's one that hasn't come out yet, so I don't want to spoil too much of it. But yeah.
Now, both of us, you and I both, have interviewed one of my favorite leading ladies in the theater, and that's Karen Ziemba, who I love.
Yes.
What was your takeaway from that interview?
Well, my takeaway from that interview was there are people who just have this sort of glow about them when they're stars, and she's definitely one of those people. And she was so funny, in addition to being so nice. When I asked her about what it was like to be nominated for a Tony, she said, it gives you 4 names, Tony nominee Karen Ziemba. So that was true.
Somehow I see a Tony in your future on some level. And then I'm going to tell you, the very first Broadway show that I ever saw was Oklahoma, 1979. I had just moved to New York. I was 18 years old at the Palace Theater. I remember the night like it was yesterday, the excitement of going to my first Broadway show, which, you've also talked about. But what was your takeaway from that interview?
Well, Christina Andreas is, again, another person with that sort of just this special radiance about her. And she had a lot of great stories. And she also wasn't afraid, like I was saying about Brad Oscar, to talk about some of the less successful things, and how this thing that she did called Fields of Ambrosia, she talked about how it was sort of hard to recover from doing that. And she also had great insight into herself and how different moments in her career would affect her personally, and things that she was talking about My Fair Lady, and she wished that she was able to sort of grasp the role earlier. And also she had great stories about Rags, which you can look forward to hearing there, because she was the understudy for Teresa Stratus out of town. And she talked about how the way she observed it, it was like there were factions of the cast turned against each other. And it was all very moving to hear. Sometimes these people will talk about their mentors in the theater and the people who helped them, which is always very interesting to me. And one of those people for her was Dina Merrill, who then did On Your Toes and Angel Street with her. And to talk about what she learned from her was something that I found interesting.
Well, who do you consider some of your greatest mentors that you've met along the way?
Well, outside of family, I want to name 3 people, if that's all right. One is Peter Felicia.
Excuse me. I think your mom just told me that you just did an interview with Peter, and it's going to be an Encore magazine, I think, in the next issue coming up. So congratulations. I subscribed, so I'll be looking forward to that.
Oh, thank you.
Peter Felicia, who I consider a mentor as well. He's just one of the best.
Yes, he is.
Who else?
And Ken Bloom and Josh Ellis are 2 other people that definitely have helped me a lot and been so nice and generous with everything.
Now, I know that this podcast came about because of the pandemic. Do you feel that you would have still gone down this path if this pandemic had not happened?
Well, that's a good question. It was always something that was in the back of my mind, but I think, and maybe you can relate to this too, although of course you had a very successful interviewing before the pandemic, but I feel as if it would be easier to get some of these great people because they're not doing shows. And some of them wouldn't be anyway, but some like Brad Oscar would have been starring in Mrs. Doubtfire. And of course it would have been hard to have interviewed him if that was happening. So I think in some ways the pandemic has been the best thing to happen to the podcast because it has.
Well, don't give away any of your trade secrets here, but so keep it close to your vest. But how are you going about getting a lot of your interviews these days? What's your method going about that?
Well, it's been through a few specific people who have been very generous with their sort of contact lists on people they know. And some of those people are Steve Ross, the cabaret singer, and Peter Felicia, and Ken Bloom, and Rob Schneider, who we were also talking about, and a set designer named Beowulf Borit, who's been a friend of our families for a while. And those people mostly have been helpful. And sometimes it will just be something as simple as just one guest will say, like, here's another friend of mine. Oh, and Walter Willison, I want to make sure not to forget.
Yes, Walter's a great guy.
Yeah, he's a great person. And sometimes it will be something like that where they'll be so helpful, and sometimes it'll be just one guest saying, here's my friend so-and-so, and I think they'd like to talk to you too.
Well, I have to say that that's a testament to you. Everyone doesn't do that, so that's a testament to what you're doing, and keep doing what you're doing. But here are two other photographs that I want to talk about with two of Broadway's favorite leading ladies.
Oh,
I love this picture.
Thank you. These are both from the Miscast Gala, which I was glad enough to be able to. This was sort of the start of my interviewing people, was being able to do this on the red carpet for the show Miscast, for the gala Miscast. And although I was able to ask like one question, I think that sort of having those face-to-face experiences with those people has been what has sort of started my skill, if you will, as an interviewer.
Right. Right. And here's that was, of course, Kelly O'Hara, and I love this picture.
Oh, thank you. And of course, I could hardly get any words out when you're talking to Bernadette Peters, but I was amazed to be standing in front of her, and it was, she was, and everyone's so nice. Like, that's something that has surprised me too, is sometimes you hear like some of the bigger stars, they might be a little sort of prickly or something like that, but that has not been the case at all.
Well, that's, I will tell you, it's very rare that you will see that side of it. At least that's been my experience. And the one thing that, and I'm sure you've learned this as well as anyone, they're people. They're more well known than anyone else, but they're people, and they have the same fears, the same hopes, the same loves, the same dreams, the same desires, but on different scales. So once you know that, you're off, off and running. I have another clip that I'm going to show. This is you performing, and this is a very early clip, and then we'll talk about this on the other side. I love the fact that you chose this song.
Waiting, yes, he's late again. Waiting, Hubie's late again. What a lovely anniversary. All alone at the Casa Cabana, me waiting for Hubie, waiting for Hubie. 10 years. 10 years, 10 wonderful, marvelous, beautiful, 10 beautiful years waiting. I know he isn't working late at the office because he hasn't got an office. I know he isn't being kept I know he's out somewhere making a big deal. Big deal. I know what he'll say when he walks in here. Baby, how are ya? Waiting, 10 years out of 10, Hubie's late again.
I just love that. What is the circumstance behind that?
Well, Do Re Mi is one of the first shows. It was that and All American were the first two sort of flops that I had fallen in love with. And when I was doing this talent show, I had considered some songs that were more modern, but I thought that maybe it would be more fun to do something that I really loved that people might not know as well. So I chose this Waiting. I decided to do something from Do Re Mi, and I looked at all the songs. And I didn't want to do Make Someone Happy because I wanted to do something a little more fun than that. And I think most of the rest of the comedy songs are duets. So I chose to do that. And that was extremely fun to be able to sing that in front of everyone.
Now, Peter points out the t-shirt. Where did you get the t-shirt?
Oh, there's another credit to Tom Judson there, which he owns this great store called Tom's Trendy Tees, where he makes t-shirts that have older Broadway flops logos on them. And so we bought this one because we thought it would be appropriate to go with this thing. And that's how I first met him.
Now, you also have your own Etsy store, and you sell your own merchandise.
Well, that's actually part of his Etsy store.
Oh, it's his. Okay. My apologies.
Oh, no. He has been nice enough to create a t-shirt and a calendar for Backstage Babble. And those have been great, and a great way to sort of advertise has been to have merchandise like that.
Well, it's great. It's wonderful that you're being an entrepreneur on all these other levels as well. So let's talk about some of your Holy Grail interviews. Who are some of the people that you're really aspiring to? And there are a lot of people watching out there. You never know who knows who. So,
yeah,
so who are some of the people that you are really aspiring to interview? And let's talk about why you want to interview them.
All right. I have to admit that I thought you might ask me this, so I made a list of some of the people.
Good.
So those people are Mickey Grant, Ben Vereen, John Kander, Sheldon Hart, Tommy Toon, Charles Strauss, and Angela Lansbury. That's my dream list there.
Well, some of those are on my list too, but I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to reach out to the ones that I know, and I know a few of those, and I'm going to see if I can make it happen. That's my gift to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Richard. That's so nice.
Great. Because I want to see you succeed. I mean, you're so wonderful at what you do. When you get an interview, what is your preparation like in terms of getting all the information, and what's the direction that you take with the interviews that you do for those who have not seen you?
Well, I think the direction I take is to try to be as complete as possible. I would like to try to talk about everything they did. Obviously, that's impossible, or it would be like 10 hours for each one. But I don't think there's anyone that I've skipped any Broadway show they did. In terms of research, there are several sites that are valuable to me. IBDB, of course. IMDb for movie work, if they've done that. IOBDB, which is the Internet Off-Broadway database. There's a site called About the Artists, which claims to list every credit of that person, which is not usually the case, but it does have something that you can't find in other places. And finally, not everyone is on here, but there's a site called Film Reference, which I've used for some guests like Walter Willison, which has really a complete list, I think, of everything they've done.
Now, we've talked about the people on your list that you would like to interview. Who are some of the stars from the past that you really wish that you had been able to interview?
Oh, well, my first choice for that, I've thought about this too, is kind of an unusual choice, which is Larry Kurt. I'd love to be able to bring back Larry Kurt to be able to talk to him about all those, about West Side Story, of course, and about A Family Affair and Company and replacing Dean Jones and Company and everything like that.
And go ahead, I'm sorry.
And the other big one, I think, like that would be Comden or Green or both, because of course there's On the Town, which started everything, and I just think their music is so great. And I'm only talking about people who are dead here. No, yeah.
Now, you have this passion for the theater, but does that passion spill over to film as well? Are you interested in interviewing people from Hollywood, movies, television?
Well, I do like Hollywood and television, although not nearly as much. Mom's actually a big expert on and fan of Hollywood and old movies, but there's more my thing. But I do enjoy, especially movies. I like to watch them. And of course, some of those have been made into musicals, like 42nd Street and TV. Yes, the only person I've ever interviewed who I think is mostly from TV has been Ed Asner, which of course you would want to interview Ed Asner.
Yes, incredible interview. Well, how did that interview come about?
Well, that is one of the few that actually just sort of happened on its own. I saw him in this virtual play he did, and I looked up this website of this virtual play, and there was a contact for like the producers. I think it turned out to actually be his daughter who runs this thing. And I reached out to that and I said, I'm Charles Kirsch, Backstage Babble, all the former guests, and I would love to be able to talk to him. And I was amazed when they said yes, but they did. And I was able to interview him for about 40 minutes. So that was great.
Wow. And out of the people from the past, are there certain interviewers that you really love to watch? From television, Johnny Carson, Merv Griffin, any of those, who are the ones that you watch on YouTube?
I have to admit, in terms of interviewers I look up to, it's more people who do stuff right now, honestly, because as I was mentioning, even since starting my podcast, I still try to listen to as many podcasts as I can. So there's Rob Schneider and his Kevin David Thomas, who's his partner, and you. And there's an American Theater Wing podcast, which I don't know the name of the person who does the interviews, but I think those are the three I sort of look to in terms of what I should be like. And I've definitely learned lessons from all three of you.
Now, when you were putting together an interview and the direction that you want to go, how often has it happened with you that the interview goes in a completely different direction from what you had anticipated? And what is that experience like for you? You were so thorough with your research, but sometimes it is going to veer off in another direction. So how do you adjust to that?
Yeah, well, I've been lucky to not have that happen a lot. I think in terms of veering, I think the thing like that will happen most is when I'm interviewing someone from a show that I really love, and I have tons of questions about that, but then it turns out they don't really want to talk about that. They want to talk about a different show, which I don't have as much about. But I find that, and this is something that definitely surprised me and that I've learned, usually I think if you ask someone one question about a show that's not too specific, I find that they'll usually say everything they have to say about that show within that one question. Mm-hmm. And even though I prepare like 5 or so on each show, I usually only end up asking one show.
And with everyone that you've interviewed so far, what has surprised you the most about yourself? Because you learn a lot from interviewing other people.
Well, one thing that has been sort of a fun surprise is that sometimes I'll be able to fill in a name or a name of a TV show or a name of a movie or a name of a play that the person can't remember. So that's been fun to be able to do sometimes. About me, I guess something that has surprised me is that I've been able to be a little more forward than I would have thought I would be able to be. I mean, of course, I don't ask like getting you in trouble questions or anything like that.
Gotcha questions.
Yeah, but sometimes if someone says they don't enjoy something, unless they just seem to really want to like move on, I find that I have been able sometimes in the moment to sort of press them a little bit on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people are not afraid to talk about other people, sometimes in a negative way, and to tell stories about them.
Now, I want to talk about some of the people that you have interviewed. And one of my favorites, of course, is Sandra Lee. And she introduced me to you. How did that interview come about?
Oh, well, Sandra Lee is someone that I've looked up to for a long time, ever since seeing her in she did a panel after a Peter Pan that she did at some theater, now at Signature Theater, something like that. And she was in this panel as the original cast member. And she told these great stories, but of course it wasn't just her on the panel. So as soon as I started this, I thought I want to be able to ask her more, and I want to be able to ask her about other things. So when Rob Schneider was the one who put me in touch with her, and I was very happy to be able to talk to her and to be able to ask her about Hello Dolly and High Button Shoes, and Peter Pan, of course.
And is there a particular question that you always use as a starting off point that is your buffer for getting going with the interview?
Well, there is, and it's a pretty simple question, which is always first, how did you get interested in theater?
Mm-hmm.
In acting or performing or directing or whatever the person does.
And what's the underlying thread with most of those interviews when it comes to that question?
Well, I find that most don't grow up in New York. Most don't grow up where they can see a lot of theater. And even most don't grow up where their families are interested in theater or even support them necessarily. So that's been the most common thread, is sort of coming from some sort of small town, or not a small town, but just not New York, and then sort of making it there.
Now, it's amazing that just since August, with what you've accomplished, what has surprised you the most about all of this? Are you amazed at the attention that's coming to you, especially since you're not putting the attention on yourself?
Yeah, I am amazed at that, and I feel lucky to have had that. And something that's amazed me most is that not everyone, but almost everyone will say yes. And I didn't expect that to happen when I started. I expected it would be about like maybe half yes, half no, or 75% yes, but it's been almost 100% yes. And everyone has been so generous with their time. And some of these, as I was mentioning, some of these interviews go for a long time. And even those who I know have other things to do will be nice enough to make time for that.
Now, I want to talk about your mom. I don't know your dad. I've only dealt with your mom, and amazing. And she just, they are so proud of you and what you are accomplishing. Is this surprising them as well, as much as it's surprising you?
I think it is a little bit, because I think they admire sort of some of the same actors I do, because we had seen all the theater together, and well, with them and with my grandmother and grandfather, but most of the things I'd seen with my parents, so they know who these actors are as well, and they're impressed that I'm able to talk to them, and they listen a lot, so that's been nice too. Yeah.
Well, what really amazes me about you, again, with all these things that amaze me about you, is that it's not that you're just a starstruck kid. You have this passion for the theater. You're interested in the people that make it happen behind the scenes. And we've talked about some of those people that are on the boards, the actors, the actresses, the stars that we know. Who are some of the people behind the scenes that you would like to interview?
That's a good question, and one I haven't given as much thought to, but one of them is Casey Nicola.
Wow.
Director. One is, definitely Scott Ellis, who I love his She Loves Me and Tootsie and all the things he's done. One of them is, I think Tommy Tune sort of counts as behind the scenes too. I guess those would be the main ones. And some of these designers who have worked for a really long time, like Anne Roth or Jane Greenwood, someone like that has done, like, they just have so many credits to their name. And they've worked on I don't want to say almost every show, but like there aren't that many designers, so it's a good chance that they'll have worked on a lot.
And I mean, you've mentioned earlier some of the mentors that you have. Some of the mentors that you have written books as well.
Yeah.
You know, have you read all of their books in their series?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing, which I started doing and then stopped doing because I find that sometimes if I read their books, there's a benefit and a disadvantage, I think. The benefit is that sometimes I can learn about stuff they've done that I wouldn't know about otherwise, and it can also give me a good sense of what they want to talk about. But on the other side of that, it can sometimes sort of spoil it for me. So then when I hear the stories, it's not as much like I'm hearing them for the first time. So I think that I read Sandra Lee's book before talking to her. I read Richard Seth's book before talking to him, but I think that I've stopped doing that as much because I think that it is fresher if I don't know that in advance.
Well, do you prefer history books of the theater or do you prefer memoirs?
Well, I think that memoirs are usually more readable, sort of. Not always, but sometimes. I do like to read a lot of memoirs. And I have read a lot of showbiz memoirs. Like some of my favorites are Charles Strauss, who I was mentioning, and Jerry Herman. Who are some of the others? Now I'm trying to think. Joel Grey was a big one, and then I got to interview him, which that was a wonderful experience because he was everything that I had pictured him as being and everything I would want him to be. And I've read, I just want to point something out here. I hope you won't mind that I saw in the chat, which is that someone said they would like to see how I would handle an interview with Charles Busch, which you can hear my 2-part interview with Charles Busch if you go on the podcast site. But I read his books. I read his plays. It's a little different, but I read a lot of his plays and listened to those that are available before I talked to him.
Well, I have to ask you, how do you fit all of this in with school?
Well, I guess another benefit of this is that school is sort of taking up less time than it would normally because of the pandemic. I have more sort of free time on my own, and I think it's not that there's less work, but it's almost like it becomes sort of, I don't want to say secondary, but it becomes almost a lesser part of your life when you're not actually going there every day.
And where do you like to see yourself 5 years from now?
That's a good question. Well, I would love to still be doing this for as long as I possibly can.
You still won't be in your 20s by then.
Well, I would, because I think there's so much more. I think at some point I'll think I've run out, but I've learned from other people that you never run out because there are always interesting people. And I mean, when you think about theater and how many people work in theater, it's a ton. And I hope that I'll be able to continue doing this and performing, as you mentioned.
And what was the last Broadway show that you saw?
Well, the last show that I saw was actually it was Six. It was the show Six on Broadway. And I saw that, I think, the Saturday before the day the theaters closed down. And it was funny because I didn't notice it really at all. My mom noticed a little more that some people were wearing masks and already being protective. I didn't notice that as much. I really enjoyed it a lot. And I know some people don't, but a lot of people do. And I had a lot of fun. And in some ways, I think it was a good way to end, if I have to end for a while, because it was just very high octane and exciting.
And it was scheduled to open the night that all the theaters shut down. Amazing. And of course, I'm going to ask you a question that nobody has the answer to. But you're a very smart guy here. How do you anticipate that theater will come back? Have you thought about that? Have you thought, how would you see theater coming back?
It's funny that you asked me that because I actually ask some of my guests that, and they get as confused as I am now when they're trying to talk about it. I don't think theaters can open at half, so I think it's going to take longer because of that. I would like to think that Broadway would be one of the first rather than one of the last things to reopen, although because it's so big and so expensive. And also there will need to be rehearsal time for everyone to get back into the flow of it. Yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit about what's ahead for you? What can we look forward to as far as some of the interviews coming up?
Oh, yes. Well, you showed photos of some of them. That's Brad Oscar, Karen Ziemba, Barry Klein.
Oh, these have not aired yet.
No. They have not. I have the next one I have is finishing with Karen Morrow, the great. She's wonderful and she has so many stories. Coming up, I have Cass Morgan and Christine Andreas and Brenda Braxton, who I just talked to the other day, and Walter Willison, who I mentioned. So a lot of people coming up.
And what's your process? How do you schedule your interviews with school and everything?
Well, I do most of them on the weekends, I have to be honest. I've done a few after school, as in like at 4 or so when school is over, which can be good, but it doesn't give me as much time to focus, like get into the right space to do it. Although sometimes it does work well, like Lee Wilkoff, who I know was watching, that was one that was after school and it was still a great one. But most are on the weekend, some are on school breaks, as I'm having one right now. And that's why I have a lot of interviews scheduled this coming week.
So you do more than one interview in one day?
I have done that a few times. Yes, I've done 2 interviews. Usually what it will be is a part, like an interview and a part 2 that will happen on the same day. Like I remember doing that with part 2 of Stephen Hannon, who's also watching tonight, and Rob Schneider. My interview with him was both on the same day. And I think I know one of the parts with Charles Bush was the same day as someone else too. And yeah, so that's another thing that surprised me, is that that's not as hard as I would have thought it would be to be able to do 2.
I think you said that your interview with Brad Oscar was 3 hours.
No, that was with Barry Kleinbort.
Oh, with Barry Kleinbort. I'm sorry. So how did you figure out how to divide it all up?
Well, as I've sort of mentioned around this, but they usually end up being 2 parts. It's rare to have one that isn't than that is at this point, because I prepare something like, it's kind of a ridiculous amount of questions, like over 100 questions for each person. And so I have enough material to keep it going for a long time, unless, of course, the person doesn't want to talk as much, but that's usually not the case. Well, with Barry Kleinbort specifically, it's interesting that you mentioned that one, because I did divide that one up in a very specific way. The first part we talked about the stuff he's written and all the great shows he's written, like 13 Things About Ed Carpellotti and Was and all those. And then in the second part, we talked about his cabaret directing work with like Nancy Dussault and Anita Gillette and Penny Fuller. And Penny Fuller is someone, and Anita Gillette too, who I've been lucky enough to talk to. And actually, Penny Fuller was one of my first really long ones, which was like 2 hours and 15 minutes. And I think she said it was one of the longest that she'd ever done, which I was thrilled to be able to do that with her.
Well, when they have a great body of worth, as I like to refer to it, it makes the interview a lot easier. And I want to ask you, because I'm a huge fan of documentaries on the theater. Are you as well? And do you have some favorites?
I am. I do like to watch those. I wish there were more, actually. Maybe there will be some more to come. My favorite one is one that's not as widely available anymore. It's called Show Business: The Road to Broadway. It was
Roy Berenstein?
Yeah. For those who don't know, I haven't been able to. But for those who don't know, that's the one where they pick a season, I think it's 2003, and they sort of track the development of Caroline or Change and Wicked and 2 other shows.
Avenue Q.
And Avenue Q. And I've been able to interview people from Taboo and Caroline or Change. So I've been able to get my own perspective on those shows. But yeah, that's one that I think I enjoy a lot, because it really does take you behind the scenes. And it shows you, like, my favorite are the moments from rehearsal where you can see like there's sort of a startling one with George C. Wolfe from Carolina Change, where he's like almost yelling at these like younger actors, and it's interesting to see the like tension sort of rising there as they prepare for the Tonys and for their opening.
Well, Charles, I can't believe this, but we are at the end of our program.
Oh.
And I know that you said that you were nervous that we wouldn't have a lot to talk about, but you are phenomenal. And I want to let you know that you are welcome here anytime. Anytime you have anything you want to talk about or promote, don't hesitate. Don't be shy. Just reach out to me, and you're right here. I want to thank everyone for being here today. If you are watching this on YouTube or on your favorite podcast platform, please leave a comment on the platform that you're watching this through. That helps in terms of building the audience for this show. And or you can go to my website, richardskipper.com, sign my guest book with your thoughts about the show. That helps to boost this show in other markets and helps also in terms of future guests. I also want to let everyone know that tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, I'm interviewing Ann Morrison. So what would you ask Ann so that I will be prepared tomorrow night?
Well, I would want to ask her mainly about Merrily We Roll Along, I think, and what that was like, and to sort of compare it to some of the things in that documentary, which is another one I like. And see. Oh, if you don't mind, can I plug one thing right now before we end?
You can plug anything you want right now.
Which is not just the podcast, but on March 20th at 7 p.m., Saturday the 20th at 7 p.m., Backstage Babble, a trivia night to benefit dancers over 40. And it will have Leroy Reams and Lawrence Loritz and Michael Levine, Ken Cantor, and Carolyn Kirsch. So that's...
We'll promote that as well, because I do a lot of events for dancers over 40. John Safakis, we love, and
he's
the work that he does. So, and anything that you're doing, feel free to let me know, and I will put it out there. I also end every show by telling everyone to go out and do something nice for somebody else without expecting anything in return. Go to your Facebook friends list and go to the 6th name that pops up and reach out to that person and let them know what they mean to you. Not with a text or an email or a private message, but with a phone call. As our dear friend David Friedman, someone else you should have on your show, David Friedman says, we're all in this together, but we're not in the same boat. Charles, I am so honored that you said yes to me. I think this is your first interview.
It is.
So how was it?
It was wonderful, and especially because of you. And I'm so honored that you asked me to do this.
Well, I'm going to give you the final word today. Anything that you want to say about anything that we talked about that you want to build upon, anything that we didn't talk about that you wish we had, or just any message that you want to put out to everyone who's watching right now. And again, thank you for all you do. I am a huge fan.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I guess for my final word, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been here tonight, and thank you. I see a lot of people who I've interviewed here in the chat, like Lee Wilkoff, who was wonderful, who I mentioned, and Stephen Hannon, and some family members. So thank you all for watching this, and I hope that you enjoyed it.
Thank you. Well, I certainly have. Go and give your mom a big hug for me. Will you do that?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Have a good night.